The hallway stretched ahead like a gauntlet. Miyoko Tanaka, who everyone called Mary, pushed through the heavy double doors of Oakland Technical High School on the morning of December 8, 1941, and immediately felt it. The silence. Not the usual Monday morning chaos of slamming lockers, laughter, and the shuffling of feet rushing to first period. This was different. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe. She walked forward, her saddle shoes clicking against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than it should. Students lined the hallways, clustered in groups, but as she passed, conversations died. Heads turned, eyes followed her, but when she tried to meet their gaze, they looked away, looked down, looked anywhere but at her face. Mary's heart hammered. Her best friend, Betty Sullivan, stood by her locker 30 feet ahead. Betty, with whom she'd shared lunches since freshman year. Betty, who'd slept over at Mary's house just 2 weeks ago, giggling over movie magazines and practicing their debate arguments. Betty, who knew that Mary's favorite color was blue and that she couldn't stand the taste of black licorice and that she dreamed of teaching English literature someday. Betty saw her coming. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. Then Betty turned, grabbed her books, and walked in the opposite direction without a word. Mary stopped walking. The hallway spun slightly. A boy she recognized from chemistry class, Tommy Morrison, whispered something to his friend as they passed. She caught only one word, sharp and ugly. Jap. Her hands trembled as she gripped her book bag tighter. What was happening? Why were they looking at her like she'd done something terrible? Why wouldn't anyone speak to her? Then she remembered. Yesterday? Sunday, December 7th. The frantic knock on the Tanaka family's front door in the afternoon. Mr. Yoshida from down the street, his face pale, his voice shaking. Turn on the radio. Now. Her father's hands fumbling with the dial, the static clearing to reveal the announcer's grave voice speaking words that didn't seem real. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, bombed, Japanese attack, hundreds dead, maybe thousands. Her mother had collapsed into a chair, hand over her mouth. Her father stood frozen, staring at the radio as if it had betrayed him. Her younger brother, Tommy, only 12 years old, had asked in a small voice, "Does this mean we're in trouble?" Mary had wanted to tell him no. She'd wanted to say they were Americans, born right here in California, that this had nothing to do with them. But the look on her father's face stopped her. He knew. Somehow, he already knew what was coming. And now, walking through the halls of the school where she'd spent 3 years building friendships, earning straight-A grades, winning debate competitions, and planning her future, Mary understood what her father had seen. The world had changed, overnight. And in the eyes of everyone around her, she was no longer Mary Tanaka, honor student and future teacher. She was the enemy. Just 6 days ago, everything had been different. Mary had woken up on December 2nd thinking about the upcoming winter formal and whether she'd have the courage to say yes if Richard Chen asked her to go. She'd worried about her debate tournament scheduled for January and whether she'd memorized enough statistics about American neutrality policy. She'd helped her mother prepare teriyaki chicken for dinner and complained about having to wash dishes. She'd been normal, ordinary, American. Her family had lived in Oakland for 23 years, ever since her father, Hiroshi Tanaka, arrived from Japan as a young man of 19, full of hope and determination to build a better life. He'd worked on farms, saved every penny, and eventually opened Tanaka Produce on 8th Street, fresh vegetables, fruits, flowers. The shop had become a neighborhood fixture. Mrs. Patterson bought her tomatoes there every Tuesday. The Kowalski family ordered flower arrangements for every birthday and anniversary. Father Murphy from St. Elizabeth's Church praised her mother's chrysanthemums. Mary had been born in 1924, right there in Oakland, delivered by Dr. Harrison at Merritt Hospital. She was as American as anyone else walking these halls. More American than some, she'd thought, because she'd never known another country. Japan was just photographs in her parents' albums, stories her grandmother told, a language she understood but barely spoke. America was home, California was home, this school was home. She'd had friends, real friends. Betty Sullivan, of course, but also Margaret Chen, whose family owned a laundry service, Eleanor Yamamoto, who played piano better than anyone Mary had ever heard, and white friends too. Patty O'Brien, who sat next to her in English class and always borrowed her notes. Susan Clark, who'd invited her to her Sweet 16 party last spring. Richard Chen, quiet and kind, who made her heart race whenever he smiled. Her teachers had loved her. Mrs. Henderson, her English teacher, had written on her last essay, "Exceptional work, Mary. You have a gift for language." Mr. Patterson, who taught American history, had called her his star pupil. She was captain of the debate team, a position she'd earned by winning the regional championship last year with a speech about the importance of democratic values. The irony of that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On the West Coast in those final peaceful months of 1941, over 120,000 people of Japanese descent had built lives much like the Tanakas. They farmed the rich soil of California's Central Valley, growing strawberries, lettuce, celery, and flowers. They ran businesses in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, in Japantown in San Francisco, in the small pockets of Oakland and Seattle and Portland, where Japanese families had clustered together for support while still reaching outward into American life. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on U.S. soil, speaking English as their first language, pledging allegiance to the flag every morning in school. They were shopkeepers and farmers, students and teachers, fishermen and gardeners. They paid taxes, they obeyed laws, they sent their children to American schools and saved money for their children's college educations. They went to church, both Christian and Buddhist. They joined the PTA and the local business associations. They were woven into the fabric of West Coast life so thoroughly that many of their white neighbors had stopped seeing them as foreign at all. Mary had believed she belonged. She'd believed that being born in America, speaking perfect English without a trace of an accent, getting good grades and following all the rules meant she was accepted. She'd never questioned it. Why would she? When Mrs. Henderson praised her essays, when Betty invited her to sleepovers, when she stood on the debate stage and argued passionately about American democracy, she'd felt American down to her bones. But now, standing in the hallway while her classmates avoided her eyes, she realized how fragile that belonging had been. It hadn't been real acceptance, it had been conditional tolerance, extended only as long as Japan remained a distant country that had nothing to do with them. The moment that connection became impossible to ignore, everything changed. The loudspeaker crackled to life. Principal Hendrix's voice, usually warm and jovial, sounded strained. "Students, please report to your homerooms immediately. Teachers, please take attendance and then bring your classes to the auditorium for an emergency assembly." The hallways erupted into motion. Mary let herself be carried along by the crowd, careful not to touch anyone, not to get too close. She found her homeroom, took her usual seat by the window, and waited. Her homeroom teacher, Miss Morrison, a young woman with kind eyes who'd only started teaching this year, gave her a small, sad smile. It was the first gesture of kindness Mary had received all morning, and it nearly broke her. The auditorium was packed. Mary sat in the back row, as far from everyone else as she could manage. 3 other Japanese-American students huddled nearby. George Nakamura, a senior who played basketball, Linda Sato, a quiet sophomore, James Ido, who'd always been the class clown. They weren't laughing now. They looked as terrified as Mary felt. Principal Hendrix took the stage. He cleared his throat, gripped the podium, and began. "Students, I'm sure you've all heard the terrible news by now. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the Empire of Japan launched an unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Thousands of American servicemen have been killed or wounded. As of this morning, the United States is officially at war with Japan." The auditorium erupted. Cheers, angry shouts, fists pumping in the air. Mary shrank into her seat. Principal Hendrix raised his hands for quiet. "I know emotions are running high. This is a difficult time for all of us. I want to remind everyone that we are Americans, and Americans conduct themselves with dignity and honor even in times of crisis. That means treating all our fellow students with respect, regardless of their background." It was a nice speech. Mary wanted to believe it would matter, but she saw the way some of the boys in the front row turned to glare at the Japanese-American students in the back. She saw the teachers exchange nervous glances. She saw Betty Sullivan sitting with her new friends, carefully not looking in Mary's direction. After the assembly, Mary went to her first period class, American History. Mr. Patterson stood at the front of the room, his face grim. When Mary entered, he paused mid-sentence, then continued without acknowledging her. She took her seat. The girl who usually sat next to her, Donna Reynolds, picked up her books and moved to an empty desk across the room. Mr. Patterson began his lecture. Today we're going to discuss what happened yesterday and what it means for our country. This attack was a cowardly act of aggression by an enemy who seeks to destroy our way of life. We will respond with the full might of American military power. He went on, and with each sentence, Mary felt smaller. He never once looked at her. He never once acknowledged that there might be nuance, might be complexity, might be students in his classroom who were hurting in ways different from everyone else. At lunch, Mary sat alone in the cafeteria. She'd brought food from home, rice balls her mother had made that morning, hands shaking as she wrapped them in wax paper. Mary stared at them, unable to eat. Across the cafeteria, Betty Sullivan sat with Patty O'Brien and Susan Clark, the girls who used to be Mary's friends. They never once looked her way. In debate club after school, things fell apart completely. Mary had been captain of the team since last spring, partnered with David Green, a senior who'd always been friendly and respectful. They'd won competitions together. They'd practiced arguments together. They'd built a partnership based on mutual respect and skill. David didn't show up. Instead, Coach Williams, who ran the debate program, pulled Mary aside. "Mary, I think it's best if you step down as captain for a while, just until things settle down. You understand, don't you? It's for your own good. Some of the other students' parents have called, and they're concerned about having a Japanese student in a leadership position right now." Mary stared at him. "I was born here. I'm American." Coach Williams wouldn't meet her eyes. "I know, Mary, I know. But tensions are high, and I have to think about the whole team. Just take a break. We'll see how things go." She left the classroom in a daze. In the hallway, she saw Eleanor Yamamoto, another Japanese-American student, crying by her locker. A group of boys walked past, and one of them hissed, "Go back to where you came from, slant eyes." Mary ran. She ran through the hallways, past the classrooms where she'd once felt safe, past the teachers who now looked through her instead of at her, past the students who'd turned into strangers overnight. She ran until she burst through the school's front doors and kept running until her lungs burned and her legs ached. When she finally stopped, she was 6 blocks from school, bent over with her hands on her knees, gasping for air. A car drove past slowly, the driver staring at her with undisguised hostility. Mary straightened and started walking toward home, keeping her head down, making herself as small and invisible as possible. She arrived home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The front window of Tanaka Produce had been smashed. Shards of glass glittered on the sidewalk. Someone had painted a word across the door in red paint, the same word Tommy Morrison had whispered in the hallway that morning. Her father was in the shop, sweeping up the glass with mechanical precision, his face blank. Her little brother Tommy sat on the stairs, holding a cloth filled with ice against his swollen eye. "What happened?" Mary asked, though she already knew. Tommy looked up at her, and in his 12-year-old eyes she saw the death of innocence. "Boys from school. They said I was a traitor. They said we bombed America. They held me down, and one of them punched me while the others watched." Mary sat down beside him and pulled him close. He buried his face in her shoulder and cried, not like a boy trying to be tough, but like a child who couldn't understand why the world had suddenly turned cruel. That night, the Tanaka family sat around the dinner table in silence. The food her mother had prepared sat untouched. Finally, her father spoke. "We've done nothing wrong. We are Americans. We will keep our heads down, work hard, and prove our loyalty. This will pass." Mary wanted to believe him, but as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her mother crying in the next room, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The morning of December 8, 1941, had taught her a lesson she would never forget. Belonging was not permanent, acceptance was not guaranteed, and in times of fear and anger, even your closest friends could turn away and refuse to meet your eyes. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare that wouldn't end. Mary woke each morning hoping that yesterday had been a terrible dream, that she'd walk downstairs to find her mother humming while preparing breakfast, her father reading the newspaper and commenting on the weather, her brother complaining about homework. Instead, she found a family paralyzed by fear, moving through their home like ghosts, jumping at every knock on the door, every car that slowed in front of their house. The newspapers made it worse. Every morning brought fresh horror printed in bold black ink. Jap treachery at Pearl Harbor. Yellow peril strikes American soil. Japanese fifth column threatens West Coast security. The Oakland Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, even the smaller local papers that had once run advertisements for Tanaka produce now competed to print the most inflammatory headlines, the most fear-mongering stories about potential sabotage and espionage. Mary's father bought every paper, reading them with an expression of growing despair. He'd spread them across the kitchen table, his finger tracing the words as if he could somehow make them say something different. Articles claimed that Japanese gardeners had planted their flowers in arrow patterns, pointing toward military installations. That Japanese farmers had chosen land near strategic locations for sinister purposes. That every person of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast was a potential spy, ready to signal enemy submarines or plant bombs in defense factories. None of it was true. Mary knew it wasn't true. Her father grew vegetables, not espionage networks. Mrs. Yamamoto down the street taught piano lessons, not sabotage techniques. Mr. Yoshida ran a dry cleaning business, not a spy ring. But truth didn't matter anymore. Fear had replaced truth, and fear was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. The radio was even worse. Mary's family huddled around it every evening, listening to broadcasts that grew more hysterical by the day. Commentators spoke in urgent tones about the danger posed by enemy aliens on American soil. Military officials gave interviews warning that Japanese Americans could not be trusted, that their loyalty to Emperor Hirohito was racial and ineradicable, that they posed a unique threat to national security. No evidence was presented, no individual cases were cited. Just broad pronouncements that condemned an entire population based on nothing but ancestry. By the second week of December, signs began appearing in store windows throughout Oakland. No Japs allowed. We don't serve Japs. Americans only. The signs spread like a disease, popping up in restaurants where the Tanakas had eaten for years, in shops where they'd bought clothes and school supplies, in barber shops and movie theaters and grocers. Mary walked past them on her way to school, each one a punch to the stomach. The pharmacy where her mother bought aspirin and cough syrup now had a sign taped to the door. The bakery where her father bought bread every Saturday morning had one in the window. Even the library, the beautiful Oakland Public Library where Mary had spent countless hours reading and dreaming, had whispered conversations among the staff about whether Japanese Americans should still be allowed to check out books. The boycott of Tanaka produce began quietly. Mrs. Patterson, who'd bought tomatoes every Tuesday for 5 years, simply stopped coming. Then, the Kowalskis stopped ordering flower arrangements. Then, Mr. Chen from the restaurant down the street, who'd bought vegetables in bulk every week, sent his son with a note saying they'd found a new supplier. Within 10 days, the steady stream of customers who'd kept the shop profitable for 2 decades had slowed to a trickle. Mary's father stood behind the counter, hands clasped in front of him, waiting for customers who didn't come. The vegetables sat in their bins, growing overripe. The flowers wilted in their vases. At night, he counted the money in the register, and his face grew grayer. They were going under, and everyone in the family knew it. The vandalism started in the 3rd week of December. The first attack was almost tentative, a broken bottle thrown through the window after midnight. Mary's father boarded it up and said nothing. 2 days later, someone spray-painted "Japs Go Home" across the front door. He painted over it, his hands steady, but his eyes haunted. Then came the night when a group of men, their faces hidden by shadows, smashed every window on the ground floor, threw bricks through the door, and scattered the produce across the sidewalk, stomping on tomatoes and kicking cabbages into the gutter. The police came. They took a report. They shrugged and said they'd look into it. They never came back. Mary's father cleaned up the destruction alone, on his hands and knees in the December cold, picking up shards of glass and ruined vegetables while neighbors watched from their windows and did nothing. The arithmetic of the betrayal was brutal in its simplicity. 23 years of building trust erased in 23 days. Hundreds of customers who'd known the Tanaka family personally, who'd shared pleasantries about the weather and asked about the children and wished them happy holidays, now crossed the street to avoid passing in front of their shop. People who'd attended Tommy's birthday parties, who'd complimented Mary on her debate trophies, who'd praised her mother's flower arrangements, now acted as if the Tanakas had never existed. The most painful betrayal came from an unexpected source. Mary's father had served in the United States Army during World War I. He'd been drafted in 1918 at age 19, just months after arriving in America. He'd trained at Camp Lewis in Washington, served in a segregated unit, and worked as a supply clerk supporting American forces. He had his discharge papers framed on the wall of the shop, proof of his service, proof of his loyalty. It meant nothing. When he went to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in early January, wearing his old uniform, hoping to show solidarity, hoping to remind people that he'd served America in its hour of need, they turned him away at the door. A man he'd served with, a man who'd shared a Europei barracks with him for 6 months in 1918, looked him in the eye and said, "We don't want your kind here anymore, Hiroshi. You understand, it's nothing personal." Mary's father came home and took his discharge papers off the wall. He put them in a drawer and never spoke of his military service again. While private citizens destroyed trust in businesses, the government destroyed what remained of Japanese-American civil liberties with methodical efficiency. The FBI raids began almost immediately. Agents descended on Japanese communities up and down the West Coast, armed with lists of names compiled over years of surveillance. Community leaders were taken first: Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, newspaper editors, officers of Japanese cultural organizations. Men who'd lived in America for decades, who'd raised American-born children, who'd built lives and businesses and reputations, were arrested in the middle of the night and hauled away without charges, without trials, without any explanation beyond the vague accusation of being potentially dangerous. Mary's uncle, her father's older brother Kenji, was among them. Uncle Kenji served as a Buddhist priest at the temple in San Francisco's Japantown. He was a gentleman who taught meditation and performed weddings and funerals. He wrote poetry in Japanese and spoke of peace and compassion. On December 9, 1941, FBI agents came to his temple at 3 a.m, ransacked his living quarters, confiscated his books and papers, and took him away in handcuffs. The family didn't know where he'd been taken. They didn't know what he'd been charged with. They didn't know if they'd ever see him again. The fear this created rippled through every Japanese household on the West Coast. If a Buddhist priest could be arrested, anyone could be arrested. If community leaders could disappear without charges, without lawyers, without due process, then the Constitution meant nothing. The rights they'd been taught to believe in, the protections they'd assumed they possessed as Americans or legal residents, proved to be as substantial as morning fog. Then came the financial attacks. On December 8th, the U.S. Treasury Department froze all bank accounts belonging to Japanese nationals. Mary's parents, both born in Japan, could no longer access their life savings. The money they'd scraped together over 23 years of hard work, the money meant for their children's college educations, for retirement, for emergencies, was gone, locked away by government decree. They couldn't pay bills, couldn't buy supplies for the shop, couldn't purchase food beyond what they could afford with the handful of cash they kept at home. Businesses collapsed overnight. Without access to capital, Japanese-owned shops closed their doors. Farmers couldn't buy seed or pay workers. Fishermen watched as federal agents confiscated their boats, claiming they could be used to signal enemy. Submarines. Families who'd worked for decades to build economic security found themselves destitute, dependent on the charity of friends and neighbors who were themselves struggling and afraid. The curfew order came in early January. Military authorities declared that all people of Japanese ancestry, regardless of citizenship, were forbidden from leaving their homes between 8 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. The order applied only to Japanese Americans. Germans and Italians, despite America being at war with their ancestral countries as well, faced no such restrictions. The message was clear. Japanese ancestry itself was suspect. Japanese blood itself was dangerous. Mary's family adjusted their lives around the curfew. Her father closed the shop before dark. They ate dinner early. They sat in their living room as evening fell, listening to the sound of their white neighbors coming and going freely while they remained trapped inside. Tommy pressed his face against the window, watching children play outside, no longer allowed to join them. In Japantown and Little Tokyo, in the small pockets where Japanese families had built communities, fear became the dominant emotion. Families held whispered conversations about what to do, where to go, whether to stay or flee inland. Some talked about moving to Denver or Salt Lake City, gambling that being away from the West Coast might protect them. Others insisted that running would make them look guilty, that staying and cooperating would prove their loyalty. And in every home, families began destroying their connections to Japan. Anything that might be considered suspicious, anything that might give authorities an excuse to arrest them, had to go. Japanese language books were burned in backyard fire pits. Photographs of relatives in Japan were torn up. Letters from family members still in the old country, precious connections to parents and siblings and cousins, were thrown into stoves and reduced to ash. Kimonos were hidden away or discarded. Japanese records and instruments were broken or buried. Families were systematically erasing their own heritage, desperately trying to appear as American as possible, hoping that if they just seemed loyal enough, cooperative enough, invisible enough, they might be spared whatever was coming. Mary watched her mother burn her grandmother's letters on a gray January afternoon. Her mother knelt beside the fireplace, feeding decades of correspondence into the flames, tears streaming down her face. The letters were written in Japanese, filled with news from a village Mary had never seen, from a woman she'd never met, but who loved her from across an ocean. Her mother had treasured those letters, reading and rereading them whenever she felt homesick. Now they were dangerous. Now they were evidence of disloyalty. "I'm sorry, Mother," Mary's mother whispered in Japanese to the burning paper. "I'm so sorry." At school, the hostility that had begun, as cold silence evolved into active cruelty. Teachers who'd once praised Mary's essays now ignored her raised hand in class. She'd sit with her arm up, knowing the answer, waiting to be called on, watching as the teacher's eyes swept past her as if she didn't exist. When she tried to participate anyway, speaking up without being called on, she was reprimanded for being rude. Mrs. Henderson, her beloved English teacher, stopped returning her graded papers with encouraging notes. Instead, Mary found her essays marked with red ink and lower grades than she'd earned before, with criticisms that seemed arbitrary and harsh. An essay she'd written about John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath came back with a C- and a note that said, "Your interpretation lacks understanding of American values." She'd written similar essays before December and received grades. The school newspaper, where Mary had contributed articles for 2 years, rejected her latest submission without explanation. The editor, a senior named Patricia Walsh, who'd always been friendly, wouldn't meet her eyes when Mary asked why. "We're going in a different direction," Patricia said vaguely. The next issue of the paper ran an editorial about the importance of patriotism and vigilance against enemy infiltration. Lunch remained the worst part of each day. Mary couldn't bear sitting alone in the cafeteria anymore, couldn't endure the weight of hundreds of eyes avoiding her, the careful way students maneuvered to keep space between themselves and her. She started eating in the bathroom, locking herself in a stall, balancing her lunch bag on her knees, tears dripping onto her sandwich while the sounds of girls laughing and gossiping echoed off the tile walls. The notes started appearing in her locker in mid-January. Slipped through the vents, they fluttered to the floor when she opened the metal door. "Go back to Tokyo." "Traitor." "Jap spy." Some were worse, filled with threats and obscenities that made her hands shake. She threw them away without showing anyone, trying to pretend they didn't exist, trying to maintain the fiction that if she just endured silently, things would get better. They didn't get better. One teacher stood against the tide. Miss Helen Morrison, the young homeroom teacher who'd given Mary a sad smile on December 8th, continued to treat her with kindness. She called on Mary in class. She graded her work fairly. She smiled at her in the hallways and said good morning. These small acts of human decency meant everything, but they came at a cost. Mary overheard two other teachers talking in the hallway one afternoon. "Helen needs to stop coddling that Japanese girl. It looks bad. People are talking." Miss Morrison's response was quiet but firm. "She's my student. She deserves the same respect as every other student." The other teachers walked away, shaking their heads. After that, Miss Morrison sat alone in the faculty lounge. The isolation was suffocating. Mary had gone from being surrounded by friends, engaged in clubs and activities, confident in her place in the world, to being invisible and unwanted in the span of weeks. She ate alone. She walked the hallways alone. She sat in the back of classrooms, no longer participating, no longer trying. The girl who'd once raised her hand eagerly, who'd debated complex political issues with confidence, who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, was disappearing. Her grades began to slip, not because the work was harder, but because she couldn't concentrate. Depression settled over her like a heavy blanket. She'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she'd done to deserve this. She'd been a good student, a good daughter, a good American. She'd followed every rule, earned every grade, made every effort to fit in and succeed. And it hadn't mattered. The moment her loyalty was tested, it was found wanting, not because of anything she'd done, but because of blood and ancestry she couldn't change. Her parents noticed, of course. Her mother touched her cheek one evening and said softly, "You're so thin, Mary. Please eat." Her father studied her report card, the first time she'd brought home B grades and even a C, and said nothing about the decline. He just folded the paper carefully and said, "These are difficult times. Do your best. Keep your head down. Don't cause trouble. Keep your head down. Don't cause trouble. Prove your loyalty through silence." These became the mantras of Japanese-American families throughout California. Don't protest. Don't complain. Don't fight back. Accept the discrimination, the vandalism, the frozen bank accounts, the curfews, the hatred. Endure it all quietly and hope that cooperation would be rewarded, that the storm would pass, that America would remember its own principles. Mary tried to follow that advice. She went to school, kept quiet, absorbed the cruelty, and said nothing. But late at night, lying in bed, listening to her mother cry and her father pace, she began to wonder if silence was the right answer. She began to wonder if loyalty could ever be proven to people who'd already decided you were guilty. She began to wonder if there was any way to win a game where the rules changed every time you thought you understood them. The collapse of community, of trust, of the life they'd built happened so fast it left them all reeling. 23 years of being neighbors, friends, customers, and fellow Americans dissolved in less than 2 months. And as January turned to February in 1942, Mary had the growing, sickening certainty that the worst was yet to come. The worst came on a cold February afternoon when Mary's father returned from checking the mail, his face ashen, holding a newspaper with shaking hands. The date was February 20th, 1942. The headline screamed across the front page, "President orders removal of all Japanese from West Coast." Mary read the shoe. Article over his shoulder, the words blurring together as her heart pounded. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 9066 the day before. The order granted military authorities the power to designate certain areas as military zones and to exclude any persons from those zones as deemed necessary. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but the intent was crystal clear. Every person of Japanese ancestry, citizen or not, would be forcibly removed from the entire west coast of the United States. No charges filed, no trials held, no evidence of disloyalty required. Simply being Japanese was enough. Her mother read the article silently, then walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat there, staring at her hands as if trying to understand how everything they'd built could be erased with the stroke of a presidential pen. Tommy, now 13, looked up from his homework. "What does it mean? Where are they sending us?" Her father's voice was hollow. "I don't know, son. The article doesn't say. Somewhere away from the coast, somewhere inland." "But this is our home," Tommy said, his voice rising with panic. "We were born here. We can't just leave, can we?" Mary's father folded the newspaper carefully, precisely, as if keeping it neat would somehow make the news less catastrophic. "We don't have a choice." The announcement sent shockwaves through Japanese-American communities up and down the West Coast. In Little Tokyo, in Japantown, in every neighborhood where Japanese families had clustered together for support and community, people gathered in homes and churches, speaking in hushed, frightened voices. Where would they go? When would they have to leave? What would happen to their homes, their businesses, their possessions? Could they come back? No one had answers. The government wasn't providing answers. They were providing orders. The notices came in early March. Posters appeared on telephone poles, in post offices, on community bulletin boards. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. The language was clinical, impersonal. All persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, would be evacuated from designated military zones. They would be allowed to bring only what they could carry: bedding, linens, toilet articles, extra clothing, kitchen utensils. Each family member could pack one suitcase or two smaller bags, nothing more. The notices gave them dates. Some families had a week, some had 72 hours. The Tanakas had 5 days. 5 days to dismantle 23 years of life. 5 days to decide what was worth keeping and what had to be abandoned. 5 days to sell a business, a house, everything they owned. 5 days to say goodbye to the only home Mary and Tommy had ever known. The panic was immediate and total. Families scrambled to sell property, to store belongings, to find someone, anyone, who would hold on to their possessions until they returned. If they returned. Churches offered to store items in their basements. A few kind neighbors, very few, offered to keep boxes in their garages and attics. But most people saw opportunity in desperation. Buyers circled like vultures. White businessmen who'd competed with Japanese shops for years suddenly appeared with cash offers. A furniture store owner offered Mary's father $50 for the entire inventory of Tanaka produce, $50 for equipment, shelving, registers, and stock that had cost thousands. When her father hesitated, the man shrugged. "Take it or leave it. You've got 3 days. Who else is going to buy?" A real estate speculator offered them $200 for their house. The house her father had purchased in 1927 for $3,000. The house where Mary had grown up, where every room held memories, where the marks on the kitchen door frame tracked Tommy's growth year by year. $200. "It's robbery," Mary's father said, his voice breaking. "Legal robbery." But what choice did they have? They couldn't take the house with them. They couldn't leave it empty and expect it to be there when they returned. If they returned. Her father signed the papers, his hand trembling, and accepted the cash. The buyer grinned as he counted out the bills. "Pleasure doing business with you, Hiroshi. Real pleasure." The arithmetic of the theft was staggering in scale. Over 120,000 people of Japanese descent lived on the West Coast. Roughly 70,000 of them were American citizens, born on American soil, with the same constitutional rights as anyone else. Or so they'd believed. The other 50,000 were Japanese nationals, immigrants who'd lived in America for decades, but were barred by law from becoming citizens because of their race. Now all of them, citizens and non-citizens alike, were being exiled from their homes. They owned farms that produced 40% of California's commercial truck crops. They owned fishing fleets that brought in millions of pounds of fish annually. They owned hotels, shops, restaurants, nurseries, and small businesses that formed the backbone of many West Coast communities. The total value of property owned by Japanese Americans in California alone was estimated at $400 million in 1942 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that would be worth billions today. All of it was being sold at fire sale prices or simply abandoned. Farmers who'd cultivated land for decades sold their property for a fraction of its worth or left it to be claimed by the state. Business owners liquidated inventory for pennies on the dollar. Families sold cars, furniture, farm equipment, anything too large to carry, to buyers who knew they had no bargaining power. The economic devastation was calculated, systematic, and utterly legal. Mary watched her father sell the produce shop to the same man, who'd bought their house, $125 for a business that had supported their family for over 20 years. The buyer walked through the shop, examining the scales, the refrigerators, the carefully built shelving, and nodded with satisfaction. "This'll do nicely. I'll keep the name, I think. Tanaka Produce has a good reputation. Customers know it." Her father said nothing. He took the money, folded it carefully into his wallet, and walked out of the shop without looking back. Mary followed, turning at the door for one last glimpse of the place where she'd spent countless hours after school, helping her mother arrange flowers, chatting with customers, doing homework at the counter while her father tallied receipts. The buyer was already rearranging things, making the space his own. They packed in silence, one suitcase each. Mary stared at her belongings, trying to decide what mattered. Her books? She could only take 2 or 3. Her debate trophies? Too heavy? Her journals? Yes, those had to come. Her favorite dress, her winter coat? Which photographs of friends and family could she bear to leave behind? Each choice felt impossible. Her mother packed her father's military uniform, his discharge papers, and the few photographs she'd allowed herself to keep, despite burning everything else. She packed practical items, needles and thread, a small first aid kit, their important documents in a waterproof envelope. She moved mechanically, efficiently, as if packing for a trip she'd never wanted to take. Tommy packed his baseball glove, 3 books, and a photograph of his Little League team from last summer. He held the photograph for a long time, looking at the faces of boys who'd once been his friends, boys who now crossed the street when they saw him. Then, he placed it carefully in his suitcase and closed the latch. Everything else stayed behind. Mary's childhood bedroom, stripped of personality. Tommy's toy soldiers and model airplanes, her mother's sewing machine, her father's tools, photo albums chronicling years of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments. The piano in the living room where Mary had practiced for years, the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals, all of it abandoned to strangers, or storage, or oblivion. On the morning of March 18th, 1942, the Tanaka family walked to the assembly point carrying their suitcases. Hundreds of Japanese-American families converged on the Oakland train station, a river of people clutching their permitted belongings, faces blank with shock and grief. Armed soldiers watched them from every corner. Buses waited to transport them to their first destination. They weren't told where they were going. They weren't told how long they'd be gone. They were simply ordered to board, and they boarded because refusing meant prison or worse. The bus ride took less than an hour. When it stopped, Mary looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. They'd arrived at Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno, not a military facility, not a housing complex, a horse racing track. Soldiers directed them off the buses and through processing. Names checked against lists, families assigned numbers. The Tanaka family became Family Unit Number 18,233. They were given tags to attach to their clothing, like luggage. Mary stared at the number pinned to her coat and felt something inside her break. Then they were led to their accommodations. The Tanakas, along with hundreds of other families, were being housed in the horse stables, the actual horse stables where thoroughbreds had lived during racing season. The stalls had been hastily whitewashed, but the smell of manure and hay remained, thick and inescapable. Each family was assigned one stall. The Tanaka's stall was 10 feet by 20 feet. 4 people were expected to live in a space designed for a single horse. There were no real walls, just partitions between stalls that didn't reach the ceiling. No privacy. Every conversation, every argument, every sound carried throughout the entire stable. At night, Mary could hear families crying, children asking why they were there, parents trying to explain the inexplicable. Cots had been set up, 4 to their stall, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, army blankets, rough and scratchy. No sheets, no pillows. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. That was it. That was home now. The communal bathrooms were in separate buildings, long wooden structures with rows of toilets and showers, no stalls, no dividers, no privacy whatsoever. Women and girls stood in line for hours, waiting their turn, then used the facilities in full view of everyone else. Mary had never felt more humiliated in her life. The simple act of using the bathroom became an exercise in degradation. Her father, who'd always been proud and dignified, who'd built a business from nothing and raised his children with firm kindness, seemed to shrink in that horse stall. He was no longer Hiroshi Tanaka, businessman and veteran. He was number 28 in Barrack 12 of the Tanforan Assembly Center. The light in his eyes, the strength Mary had always relied on, began to fade. Tommy stopped speaking. He'd sit on his cot staring at the whitewashed walls, not responding when Mary tried to talk to him. He ate mechanically when food was provided. He followed instructions when given. But the cheerful, energetic boy who'd played baseball and gotten excited about comic books had disappeared, replaced by a hollow-eyed child who'd learned that the world was neither fair nor kind. Thousands of people lived at Tanforan, families from all over the Bay Area, torn from their homes and communities, now crammed into horse stalls and hastily constructed barracks. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Watchtowers loomed over the grounds, searchlights sweeping across the assembly center at night. Barbed wire topped the fences, the sharp metal glinting in the sun. The message was clear. They were prisoners. They could call it an assembly center, a relocation camp, a temporary housing facility, but the guards had guns, the fences had barbed wire, and no one was allowed to leave. Mary stood in line for meals 3 times a day. Lines for the mess hall, lines for the bathroom, lines for medical care, lines for everything. She'd wake at dawn and immediately join the line for breakfast, because if you waited too long, the food ran out. She'd stand for 2 hours, shuffling forward slowly, her back aching, her legs tired, just to receive a plate of rice and canned vegetables. The dehumanization was systematic and deliberate. Strip people of their homes, their possessions, their privacy, their dignity. Reduce them to numbers. House them like animals, make them stand in line for basic necessities, break their spirits so thoroughly that they'll accept whatever comes next without resistance. And it was working. Mary saw it in her father's vacant stare, in Tommy's silence, in her mother's trembling hands. She saw it in the other families around them, people who'd been confident and proud now moving through the assembly center like ghosts, going through the motions of survival without really living. At night, lying on her straw-stuffed mattress, Mary stared at the ceiling of the horse stall and tried to remember who she'd been, the girl who'd captained the debate team, the girl who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher, the girl who'd believed that being born in America and working hard and following the rules would be enough. That girl felt very far away now, like a character from a book Mary had once read and half forgotten. The only thing that kept her from disappearing completely was anger. A small, hard kernel of rage that grew a little bigger each day. Anger at the government that had done this, anger at the neighbors who'd turned away, anger at her teachers who'd abandoned her, anger at Betty Sullivan and all her former friends who'd decided Mary's friendship wasn't worth defending. Anger at a country that claimed to value freedom and justice, but had stripped both away from 120,000 people whose only crime was having Japanese ancestors. That anger, Mary realized, might be the only thing worth holding on to. It was proof she was still human, proof she could still feel something other than despair. She wrapped herself in it like a blanket on cold nights and promised herself that someday, somehow, she would make this mean something. She would tell this story. She would make sure people knew what had been done and why it must never happen again. But first, she had to survive, because Tanforan was only the beginning. The rumors spreading through the horse stalls spoke of permanent camps being built in deserts and wastelands, far from the coast, far from anything resembling civilization. This was temporary housing while the government prepared more. Permanent prisons, and in the summer of 1942, the Tanaka family would board another train, heading even further from home, toward a place called Topaz in the Utah desert. Mary tucked her journal under her pillow and closed her eyes, trying not to think about tomorrow, trying not to think about what came next, trying not to think at all. The trains left Tanforan in September of 1942, long lines of cattle cars that had been minimally converted for human transport. The Tanaka family boarded with hundreds of others, clutching their belongings, having no idea where they were going or when they'd see the Bay Area again. Armed guards stood at every door. The windows were covered with shades that passengers were forbidden to raise. They traveled blind, rumbling through landscapes they couldn't see, toward a destination no one would name. The journey took 3 days. 3 days in cramped, stuffy cars with inadequate bathrooms and minimal food. Children cried. Old people grew sick from the heat and poor ventilation. Mary sat pressed against her mother, feeling the train sway and lurch, wondering if this was what it felt like to be cargo, a thing being shipped from one warehouse to another, stripped of agency and humanity. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, the blast of heat hit like a physical force. Mary stepped down onto a wooden platform and stared at the landscape stretching before her. Desert. Nothing but desert in every direction. Flat, barren land covered in sagebrush and dust, ringed by distant mountains that shimmered in the heat. The sky was huge and empty and offered no shelter from the sun beating down at over 100 degrees. Welcome signs posted near the platform read, "Topaz War Relocation Center." But there was nothing welcoming about it. Before them stretched a grid of tar paper barracks, hundreds of identical black buildings arranged in perfect rows, surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers. Armed guards looked down from their elevated posts, rifles clearly visible. Searchlights mounted on the towers would sweep the camp at night, Mary would later learn, ensuring that no one approached the fences after dark. 10,000 people would be imprisoned here, in Topaz, Utah, in the middle of the Sevier Desert, 1 square mile of dust and desperation, 16 miles from the nearest town. The camp had been constructed in a matter of months, built by contractors who'd done the minimum required and pocketed the rest of the government money allocated for the project. The result was buildings that looked temporary because they were temporary, structures never meant to house human beings for years. The Tanakas were assigned to Block 12, Barrack 8, Apartment C. The word apartment was grotesque in its inappropriateness. Their new home was a single room, 20 feet by 25 feet, in a long building divided into 6 such units. Tar paper covered the outside. Wood planks formed the walls with gaps between them wide enough to see through to the outside. A pot-bellied stove sat in one corner for heat, though fuel would prove scarce. 4 cots, 4 thin mattresses, 4 army blankets. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. That was everything. No running water in the barracks, no bathrooms, no kitchen. For those necessities, residents had to brave the elements and walk to communal facilities scattered throughout each block. In the summer heat, which regularly reached 110 degrees, the walk was brutal. In winter, when temperatures dropped below zero and snow piled high, it became dangerous. Elderly internees froze walking to the bathroom at night. Children got frostbite waiting in line for showers. The dust was the worst part. The desert soil, disturbed by construction and 10,000 feet walking over it daily, turned into fine powder that infiltrated everything. Dust in your hair, your clothes, your food, your lungs. When the wind picked up, which happened frequently, dust storms would sweep across the camp with such ferocity that visibility dropped to 5 feet. People tied handkerchiefs over their faces and felt their way along barrack walls, unable to see where they were going. Mary once got lost in a dust storm walking back from the mess hall, disoriented and choking, until a stranger grabbed her arm and guided her to shelter. The camp had been designed with ruthless efficiency. Blocks were numbered and identical. Each block contained 14 barracks, a mess hall, a laundry room, a latrine, and a recreation hall. The layout was militaristic, meant for control and surveillance. Guards could see every part of the camp from the watchtowers. Fences topped with barbed wire ran along the entire perimeter. Signs were posted every 100 feet. Beyond this point, you will be shot. Those weren't empty threats. Within the first 6 months of operation, guards shot 3 internees who approached the fences. One was a young man chasing a baseball that had rolled near the wire. One was a woman who'd wandered near the boundary while collecting rocks for a garden she was trying to build. One was an elderly man, hard of hearing, who didn't respond quickly enough when a guard shouted at him to stop. The guard fired. The man died. No one was prosecuted. The official report called it a regrettable incident and blamed the victim for not following instructions. After that, everyone knew the guards had permission to kill, and they would use it. Parents stopped letting children play near the edges of the camp. People walked with their eyes down, careful never to stray too close to the wire, even accidentally. The invisible threat of violence hung over everything, a constant reminder that they were prisoners, that their lives were worth less than obedience. Daily life in Topaz was an exercise in degradation. Families ate in mess halls, standing in line 3 times a day for meals prepared in industrial kitchens and served on metal trays. The food was cheap and poorly prepared, heavy on starches, light on nutrition: rice, potatoes, bread, canned vegetables, mystery meat that no one could identify. Families no longer ate together in the traditional sense. Children ate with their friends in one corner. Teenagers clustered at different tables. Parents sat separately. The mess hall system destroyed the family meal, one of the fundamental structures that had held Japanese-American families together. Bathrooms offered no privacy whatsoever. Long buildings contained rows of toilets with no stalls, no dividers, just toilets lined up side by side. Showers were communal, multiple showerheads in one open room. Women and teenage girls bathed in full view of each other, modesty impossible, dignity abandoned. Mary learned to shower at odd hours, very early or very late, when fewer people would be there. But there was no escaping the humiliation entirely. Her father, once the head of their household, a man of authority and dignity, became a shell of himself in Topaz. The camp structure undermined parental authority at every turn. Children ate when the mess hall served food, not when their parents said. They spent their days in schools and recreation programs run by the camp, not under parental supervision. Fathers had no jobs, no purpose, no way to provide for their families. The government gave each internee a small allowance, $12 per month for laborers, $16 for professionals. Everyone received the same food, the same housing, the same treatment, regardless of what they had achieved or built in their former lives. Mary watched her father shrink into himself. He'd sit on his cot for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally walking the perimeter of the block as if looking for something he'd lost. He rarely spoke. The man who'd built a business from nothing, who'd served his country in uniform, who'd raised his children with firm kindness and high expectations, had been reduced to a number in a government camp, stripped of purpose and pride. Tommy, now 13, had stopped speaking entirely at Tanforan. In Topaz, he remained silent for months. Mary would try to engage him, asking questions, telling stories, anything to get a response. He'd look at her with empty eyes and say nothing. Their mother worried constantly, but there were no therapists in Topaz, no mental health services, no help for children traumatized by displacement and imprisonment. Families simply endured and hoped their children would eventually recover. Yet despite everything, the internees built a community, because that's what human beings do. They survive. They adapt. They create meaning even in meaningless circumstances. Within months, Topaz had schools, newspapers, churches, gardens, sports leagues, and art classes. The resilience was remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. People were determined to maintain their humanity behind barbed wire. Mary enrolled in Topaz High School, a strange institution housed in barracks and taught by a mix of internee teachers who'd been educators before the war and white Quaker volunteers who'd come to help. The Quakers were conscientious objectors who believed the incarceration was morally wrong and wanted to do something, however small, to help. They taught classes, organized activities, and treated the internees with a respect that felt radical in that environment. One teacher, a Quaker woman named Eleanor Davis, ran the school newspaper. She encouraged students to write honestly about their experiences, to document what was happening, to bear witness. Mary joined the newspaper staff and found her voice again. She wrote articles about daily life in Topaz, about the dust storms and the cold winters, about families trying to maintain traditions in impossible circumstances, about the small victories and large injustices. Writing gave her purpose. Her anger, which had been a formless thing eating away at her insides, crystallized into determination. She would document this. She would tell their story. She would make sure that someday people would know what had been done to 120,000 innocent people in the name of national security. The camp library became her refuge. It was small, stocked with donated books, but it offered an escape from the barracks and the dust. Mary read everything she could find about American history, about the Constitution, about civil rights and democracy. She read about the Founding Fathers and their promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. She read about Frederick Douglass and his fight against slavery. She read about Susan B. Anthony and the suffrage movement. She read and began to understand that America had always been a nation at war with itself, a country that proclaimed beautiful ideals while consistently failing to live up to them. Miss Morrison, her former teacher, continued to write letters. Mary had written to her from Tanforan, and Miss Morrison had responded immediately with kindness and outrage. She sent books, magazines, words of encouragement. She wrote about what was happening in Oakland, how the Japanese American students were missed, how some teachers felt ashamed of what the government was doing. Her letters were lifelines, reminders that not everyone had turned away, that some people still believed in justice. In one letter, Miss Morrison wrote, "Mary, I know you must be angry. You have every right to be, but don't let that anger consume you. Channel it into something productive. Write about this. Tell your story. Someday, this will be seen as one of America's greatest shames, and your testimony will matter." Mary kept that letter tucked in her journal. She read it whenever despair threatened to overwhelm her. She wrote in her journal every night, documenting the details of camp life, the conversations she overheard, the small kindnesses and large cruelties, the way imprisonment was changing everyone. The worst moment came in February of 1943 when the government distributed loyalty questionnaires to all internees over 17 years old. The questionnaire contained 33 questions, but 2 of them tore the community apart. Question 27 asked if the respondent was willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States in combat duty. Question 28 asked if they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor. The cruel irony was staggering. The government had imprisoned them without charges, stripped them of their rights, housed them like animals, and now demanded they prove their loyalty by volunteering to die for the country that had betrayed them. Young men who'd been incarcerated for a year were being asked to serve in the military while their families remained behind barbed wire. Parents were being asked to forswear allegiance to Japan, even though many had never sworn allegiance to Japan in the first place and couldn't become American citizens due to racist naturalization laws. The questionnaire divided families, divided friends, divided entire blocks. Some people answered yes to both questions, determined to prove their loyalty, believing that cooperation would lead to better treatment. Others answered no to one or both questions, either out of protest against their imprisonment or because they couldn't honestly swear allegiance to a country that had treated them so unjustly. Those who answered no to question 28 were labeled disloyal, troublemakers, and were eventually sent to a maximum security camp at Tule Lake, California. The Tanaka family spent days arguing about how to respond. Mary's father believed they should answer yes, that cooperation was the only path forward. Mary's mother agreed, terrified of being labeled disloyal. Mary herself was torn. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protest, to say no to a government that had no right to demand anything from them. But she also understood the practical reality. No answers could mean harsher treatment, permanent imprisonment, even deportation to Japan, a country she'd never seen and didn't consider home. In the end, they all answered yes. But Mary felt like a coward. She'd stayed silent when she should have protested. She'd cooperated when she should have resisted. The only way she could live with that choice was to promise herself that when this was over, when she was free, she would never be silent again. The war finally ended in August of 1945. The news spread through Topaz like wildfire. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. People celebrated and wept, relief and grief intertwined. But the question everyone asked was, what happens now? Would they be released? Would they be allowed to go home? Would they have homes to go to? The camps began closing in late 1945 and early on 1946. The government gave each family $25 and a train ticket to wherever they wanted to go. $25 to restart lives that had been worth thousands. $25 after 3 years of imprisonment. $25 as compensation for homes, businesses, futures destroyed. The Tanaka family returned to Oakland in March of 1946. The train journey back felt surreal, moving through landscapes that were familiar and foreign at once. When they arrived and walked through their old neighborhood, Mary felt like a ghost visiting a place she'd once lived. Their house was occupied by a white family who refused to open the door when they knocked. Their shop, Tanaka Produce, had a new owner and a new name. Everything they'd built was gone. They moved into a cramped apartment in a part of town that hadn't been good even before the war. Her father found work as a gardener, doing manual labor for people who'd once been his customers. Her mother took in sewing. Tommy, now 16, got a job at a warehouse, his education interrupted, his dreams abandoned. They started over from nothing, and it nearly broke them. But Mary refused to break. She enrolled at the University of California, Berkeley, working multiple jobs to pay tuition, determined to get the education she'd dreamed of. She studied English and history. She wrote essays about the camps, about civil rights, about the responsibility of citizens to stand against injustice. She became active in the Japanese American Citizens League, an organization fighting for the rights of former internees. She became a teacher, just as she'd always planned. She taught high school English in Oakland, and on the first day of every school year, she would tell her students about the camps. She would show them photographs, read them passages from her journal, explain how easily freedom could be stolen when people were afraid. Decades passed. The camps became history, something taught in textbooks, sanitized and distant. But Mary never forgot. She testified at hearings, she spoke at universities, she wrote articles and gave interviews. And in 1988, when she was 64 years old, the United States government finally issued a formal apology. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 acknowledged that the incarceration had been based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It provided $20,000 in reparations to each surviving internee. $20,000. A fraction of what had been stolen, but an acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong. Mary testified before Congress that year. She stood in a hearing room in Washington, D.C., now a gray-haired woman with the bearing of someone who'd survived the unsurvivable, and told her story one more time. She described December 8, 1941, the day her white friends wouldn't look at her. The collapse of her world in a matter of days. The horse stalls and the dust storms and the barbed wire and the armed guards. The loss that could never be fully calculated or repaired. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady, "not for myself, but for the children who grew up behind barbed wire, for the parents who lost their dignity, for the businesses and homes and futures that were destroyed. I'm here to make sure this is remembered, so it never happens again." The following year, Mary returned to Oakland Technical High School for a special assembly. She walked through the same hallways she'd walked as a frightened 16-year-old, past the lockers where cruel notes had been left, past the classrooms where teachers had looked through her instead of at her. But this time, she walked as an invited guest, a teacher herself, a survivor and witness to history. She stood before an auditorium full of students and began to speak. "I want to tell you about the day my white friends wouldn't look at me," she said. December 8, 1941. "I walked through these hallways and everyone turned away. I want to tell you what happened next and what it taught me about the fragility of freedom." The students listened, silent and attentive, as Mary Tanaka shared the story she would tell until her death in 2003. A story of betrayal and survival, of injustice and resilience, of the terrible ease with which a democracy could abandon its principles when fear took hold. A story that must never be forgotten.